Hi Daniela, thank you for your question about creating brushes and the new interface in Procreate 5. I've actually spent the week looking at the Procreate support guide, trying to work out exactly what they have changed. And to be honest, this is way beyond my brush creating abilities. And I'll tell you why. When I was first getting into Procreate, I was so frustrated with the brushes. There were so many brushes, and yet I couldn't seem to get the results that I wanted. And so I said to Sean, what brushes are you using? Have you bought specific custom brushes? And he said, no, I refuse to do that. I will limit myself to what is in there already because there are so many that I must be able to work with them. And so I took that as a challenge and I decided to do the same. And so the only small tweaks that I have made to my brushes, like this one, which I call my custom watercolor brush, I actually, if you look at it, I built it from this round brush. And the only real major difference is the opacity and this tapering at the beginning, because I wanted to be able to get into quite tight corners if I needed to with the beginning of my strokes without constantly going outside of the lines. So I adjusted the front taper and then I adjusted the opacity. But of course the opacity you can adjust on any brush all the time just by tweaking this up and down. So that is not a major and permanent thing. And Procreate, unlike some other programs like Photoshop, doesn't, it saves the brush at whatever I last used it at. So if I had this watercolor brush and the last time I used it, it was at 40%. When I next open Procreate, it'll be at 40% again. So that is a bit frustrating. But anyway, let's go into the back and just have a look. If you look, the things that I look at if I have to tweak something is usually the taper. And that is mostly for outlining things. So as I say, I changed the taper at the beginning of the stroke because I wanted to get into corners. But usually I don't worry about taper on a painting brush very much. Taper is more something that I worry about for a thick and thin line that I'm looking for. The other thing now, I don't think they used to have anything about rendering, but now they have this about rendering. And the default is what they call light glaze, and that is what I will stick with. Reading through the guide, they say that a heavy glaze is when you've got really thick paint on the canvas. And to my mind, watercolor is never going to need thick paint. So I stick with this light glaze, which is the default, or the way it was for where my brush was set up in Procreate 4. And the other important thing for me in painting is this flow, and I set it to max. And what they mean by flow is, do you get more pigment on the paper if you press harder with your Apple Pencil? And I don't want that. I want the amount of pigment I get to come from the opacity. So I don't adjust the flow. I keep it at maximum so that every time I touch my point to the paper, to the canvas, I'm going to get the same amount of color laid down. Because if I adjust this, let's take it down to here, and then you look at this, the flow it's not as much. It's only 53%. So if we go and have a look and say, okay, let's choose a color. This flow, it's 50% of 20%, which is not what I want. I want to adjust the amount of paint that goes onto the canvas here with opacity and not here with a setting behind the scenes. So I will keep my flow at max. And then here you can see now it's 100%. If I take it down to 20%, I'd rather be able to dynamically adjust that here than be confined behind the scenes with the flow. So those are the only two things that I look at. And wet edges, I don't worry. I've tried adjusting this to maximum or nothing, and I cannot see a difference. So I'm not sure what has changed between Procreate 4 and Procreate 5, but wet edges is now standard, or I get the effect that I want from wet edges just by having my adjustment of my opacity. Then there's also this thing called wet mix, and I wondered if perhaps that was important as well. So I went and checked this dilution, and you can see it's almost like they're adding more paint to it. So if we go here and let's go, we've got 20%. Now, I'm getting nothing. Well, I don't even know what's going on. I'm not sure why it's not showing anything. So, oh, there, you see I get this funny grizzly effect, which I don't want at all. I want smoothness. So the only thing that I'm looking at here is getting a slight taper on the tip of as I start my stroke. I'm looking at sticking with a light glaze and a full flow in my rendering. And I'm completely ignoring dilution. I'm keeping it at maximum. These things used to be in Procreate 4 and I never touched them. I've never actually adjusted any of this. So those are the main things. Then Apple Pencil, again, opacity and flow, because this is related to the pressure on your Apple Pencil. So if I put more pressure on my Apple Pencil, do I want the size to go up? No, not when I'm painting. Do I want the opacity to go up? No, not at all when I'm painting. Do I want the flow to change? Not at all when I'm painting. I don't need smoothing because I'll do that when I'm smudging or blending. So I don't touch this at all for my paint brushes. So I hope that, well, I'm not sure that that's really going to help you a lot, but it does give you an insight into how I work with my brushes. And that is a very minimal amount of tweaking. I do not consider myself a brush creator or a brush engineer. I'm a brush fiddler. And I just know enough to slightly tweak the results that I was getting to be able to do the sort of painting that I learned from Sean. And that is pretty much where I start with an outline like this, and using 20% opacity, I go and I choose my colors and I blend in, adding shadows and so on with different color. And I don't like streaks, but I do like a bit of variation and a bit of texture sometimes. And if I don't want that variation and texture, then I go in and I use the smudge tool set to my same brush. And then I work from the darkest area to the lighter area, as you would have seen in my course, pushing the dark color into the light color like this so that I gradually get a smoother effect. So I rely on my actual brush and this blending tool occasionally. I generally don't worry with the blending tool. I do manual blending. But if I want something smoother, the blending tool is always there for me. And so when it comes to actually engineering new brushes, that is way past my pay grade. I don't aspire to do that. I leave that to the real artists out there who have much more knowledge of how real paint works on real canvas for oil paint and whatever else. But the way I work works for me. So I don't know if that answers your question, but at least it answers it as much as I can. And I'm going to create a screenshot of the Procreate support manual that I've been referring to, and I'll include that and a link to it. So if you want to go in, and I'm sure you can get that in Italian, and if you want to try to understand it and start engineering your own brushes.